I have got a subject called a holistic view on continuous improvement, and it's a bit of a mouthful to chew on, but it's sort of one of those continuous improvement. I think if that's not in every corporate executive's mantra, then I don't think they've been to business school or they're managing their businesses properly. So it's probably a slogan which all of you have heard a lot of. So let's start a little bit with definitions here. When we talk a holistic view of continuous improvement, first of all, we need to touch on the subject, what is holistic? And I think that's probably an important start, because you probably heard the term, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. If we just focus on certain elements within our organization or certain parts of your plant, clearly we can maximize the efficiency there, but or the cost efficiency, or whatever drivers that you're currently using. But if we don't do it holistically, it comes to naught. So we've always got to keep sight of the fact that a plant or an organization has to be viewed holistically. And then the sum of the parts can be more than the whole. The whole can be more than the sum of the parts. If the parts don't function well together, then clearly what we're going to have is the whole will be less than the sum of the parts. There's probably a whole webinar just on that on its own, but this is just a quick stab at the holistic aspect of it. The next thing I want to just allude to, as an organization, is a complex system. And we obviously focus specifically on mineral processing, but no mineral processing plant runs on its own. It runs because there are a whole lot of human beings and people that make it work. And as we know, not just from a process point of view, from a plant process point of view, the complexity lies in the entire flow sheet, but it also lies in our ability to marshal the people that run this organization. And when we look at process improvements, which is obviously the aspect of continuous improvement, and we're looking at cost saving, innovation, we tend to focus on 4 different areas. So the first one is, and you'll hear a little bit of that today, on technology. And that tends to be sort of often for us engineers the go-to. So let's see if we can find some tech that can fix something or do something quicker, or make it more efficient, or, you know. So that's one part of it. The second is we focus on process, and process now not in the mineral technology term, but in the term of the process of how an organization runs. So the inherent bureaucratic processes, the approvals, the placement of orders. So those kind of processes, how do we improve that? Second part of process improvement when we look at process or continuous improvement. Then clearly we talk about people. And I said to you earlier, if we don't have the skills, we don't have the organization functioning as a whole, clearly the organization is not going to function very well. And that we focus specifically on people and people skills, and optimizing that aspect of it. What I want to talk to you today about is a 4th aspect of organizational culture. So it is ultimately probably a relatively new thing. It's been something that intuitively most leaders and most managers have known and understood, but not necessarily made as a conscious aspect of running a business. What is organizational culture, and how does it influence your continuous improvement? So I'm going to quickly touch on organizational culture. Here are a couple of statements that you'll be able to relate to. That's the way we do things around here, okay? We can relate to that. Or collective patterns of behaviors, values, and unwritten rules that develop over time. Behaviors are the observable part of what we see on a day-to-day basis. So culture is a lot about behaviors. It's not about what's written on the walls or in your value statement, it's what we do every day. And lastly, culture impacts policies, procedures, operations, and day-to-day actions of all employees. So I'm giving you a quick definition of culture. It's a complex, big subject, and I'm not an academic, and I'm not going to give you much more than that. I have actually one more slide, which will sort of also give you a snapshot of what it is that you can look for because culture is not something necessarily spoken about in many companies. It is quite elusive. So here's a slide, and there's quite busy, so there are quite a few aspects I want to quickly talk about. So when you talk about culture, focus on what are the rituals within the business, for instance. What do you do every day or once a month when you induct people? What's the rite of passage? You know, do you have certain rites of passage to become an MD or to become a salesperson? What do you do there? What are the norms of the organization? And in this particular case, 40% of culture can be influenced by the founder's values. So if you still have access to the founder or can read up about what the founder, who the founder was of your business, you get a good understanding of what they brought into the business right at the outset. And then maybe lastly, the stories we tell each other. What stories as colleagues do we tell each other within the organization? That'll give you an idea where your culture is. I've been told that culture is a little bit like a fish swimming in water. The fish never really question the water, but the water is the culture. And we need to get a little bit more conscious about our culture to understand whether it supports continuous improvement and whether it supports our strategy. We also need to develop a language to understand how culture is. Now, I'm going to give you a few terms. These are quite academic, and I had to research them myself. But first of all, a concept called cultural relativism. It is the ability to understand the culture on its own terms and not to make judgments from the standards of one's own culture. Now, clearly here in South Africa or in a multinational business where you're constantly dealing with cross-cultural issues, it's very important that the more dominant culture within the organization actually takes a view that they are not the better culture. They are not superior. We have, for instance, as an example in South Africa, there's an aspect of one of the population groups within our country that celebrates its ancestry worship. Now, ancestry worship means a lot for one culture and means a lot less for another culture within the bigger context of a country. The question that you have in terms of cultural relativism is, do not judge or ridicule or downplay the importance to someone else. Respect their culture and their views. Then a concept that I want to just talk about briefly is ethnocentrism. Again, in our country, we've often had these debates about what's Eurocentric and what's Afrocentric, and that's probably a bit too simplistic in terms of what's your background and where do you come from. But ethnocentrism can also be there's a correct culture and an incorrect culture, and that leads to probably quite a bit of conflict within an organization if you've got cross-cultural aspects to deal with. Then two more terms that I'm throwing at you here, but enculturation. So the element of teaching the culture of your organization or learning it. You obviously come into a new organization and you'll figure out that, wow, they do things differently in this company than they do in some other company, because there is a different corporate culture in different companies. So enculturation is the process of learning to acquire the cultural values of that organization. Now, we know that very simply, every family raises children, and those children are raised within the culture of that community. Quite simple. I think that's something most people will understand. And then lastly, the aspect of acculturation is an element of assimilating different cultures. And again, I like the example within South Africa. After '94, there was definitely an assimilation of cultures, and you can often see that in the language that comes about. So in the English, the dominant business language in South Africa, we started using some African words, and they became part of the way we talk. So if we say yes, the Zulu word for that is yebo, and it becomes just part of the slang and the nature. So in acculturation, you start bringing in aspects of different cultures. And I think in terms of any corporate culture, you will assimilate the values of other cultures in some form or another. And then clearly that brings you to cultural knowledge. So having a better cultural knowledge will help you understand the culture of your organization a bit better. Right, and then the norms within the organization, clearly that also is part of your cultural knowledge. So my last slide in conclusion is really to hone in on some of the impacts. So recognizing the challenge to continuous improvement, you need to acknowledge the complexity and fluidity of organizational culture. So recognizing your culture is important because it can fight continuous improvement. It's quite uncanny when we say in our values that we aspire to continuous improvement and then we struggle to make it happen because it invokes an aspect of change. And we often hear, oh, change is difficult, or in this company, no, this is something we don't do. Change is hard. And continuous improvement is about change. Does your culture absorb that? Does it take it on? Does it appreciate it? How does it celebrate improvements? Probably a statement that for me burnt a real strong message in my mind: culture eats strategy for breakfast. If you don't understand your culture, whatever strategy you have that fights the culture will not be sustainable. So understanding your culture, and if you're driving towards a strong continuous improvement mindset, you must know that the culture has to support that. More often than not, the culture in an organization fights that. The culture often supports the status quo, and you run into a bit of an issue, and that's why continuous improvement often is thwarted by the culture of an organization. Organizations need to articulate its real culture before it can embark on the path of developing its ideal culture. So it's tricky enough understanding your own culture, and then on top of that, you now got to figure out what is a high performance culture, what is an ideal culture, and how do you start moving in that direction. And I say this applies as much to any organization, whether it's the small team that runs a mineral processing plant, or a Multotec that runs multiple manufacturing facilities and a huge sales organization, or an Anglo-American or a Glencore that runs thousands and thousands of people in an organization. This is as relevant to a two-man operation as it is to a huge multinational organization. So this ultimately leads to the alignment to business goals and strategies. If your culture is going to be successful, it will align itself to your goals and strategies. And that's the Holy Grail, I think. And I've probably just given you a taster. I haven't given you a formula. I haven't given you what to do or how to go about it. But it's a process of trying to understand culture and how that then aligns. It's a hidden aspect of the business that is intrinsic to the success of any organization. And you cannot embark on continuous improvement holistically if you don't start talking about culture. Thank you very much. I just want to give a quick heads up to some reference material, and you'll get this later if you're interested. There's a paper produced called The Holistic Approach on Process Improvement from many years back, and it talks about these 4 aspects of continuous improvement. A very helpful document, and one that even gives you some hints at how to go about on this journey. It's not a one-trick pony. This is definitely a process. This is definitely a big story. It definitely needs to be owned and run by the heads of your organization. But it can start within the organization. There's no question that critical mass can build within a core team of people, but it is a big challenge. And that's my story. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this presentation.